Welcome back. Today's viewer story, sent in by Cecilia Vance, is the ultimate tale of betrayal and a truly shocking discovery. After being humiliated and called the maid by her daughter-in-law, Cecilia walked out of the house she paid for. But the real story began when she uncovered a 30-year-old hospital secret. Her son was switched at birth. Get ready to witness a mother's silent, strategic reckoning. Have a story of family betrayal or a great comeback? Email us at womenstoriess@segmail.com. Now, let's start the journey. I spent my whole life giving love, time, money, myself. Until one night, over a dining table filled with food I bought, I heard something that shattered me forever. This isn't just a story of humiliation. It's a story of awakening. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, this story is for you. Make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know your story, too. I still remember the soft clink of crystal glasses. The expensive, newly purchased crystal glasses I had picked out last month. The low hum of classical violin music floated through the house I paid for, the one still legally in my name. The smell of the herb-crusted rack of lamb I had seasoned that morning, slow roasting while I ran frantic errands for a gathering I wasn't even supposed to be a part of. But I was there because my daughter-in-law, Chloe, 30, had completely forgotten to tell me her parents, the Richardsons, were joining. And the house, of course, needed to look immaculate. I was merely the invisible, behind-the-scenes engineer, making the evening run smoothly. I should have known better than to stay. I should have known what was coming the moment Mrs. Richardson, Chloe's mother, a woman with those half-curious, half-condescending eyes, looked across the brightly set table and asked, "And you are?" Darren, 32, my son, was across the table, busy on a work call he'd stepped away from, barely paying attention. Chloe didn't miss a beat. She paused, took a casual sip of her non-disclosed wine brand sparkling wine, and then let out a sharp, affected laugh, as if the answer were the funniest thing in the world. "Oh," she said, waving her wrist dismissively in my direction, displaying her heavy, a non-disclosed jewelry brand bracelet. "That's Cecilia, our resident caretaker. She handles all the running of the house." Our resident caretaker, the help. Everyone laughed lightly. The Richardsons chuckled politely at the little domestic joke. Even my son, Darren, offered a small, distracted smile of amusement before quickly tapping back into his phone. I just stood there, holding the empty Pinot Noir bottle I had just replaced from the kitchen cooler. I kept a polite, quiet smile glued firmly to my face, as if the oxygen hadn't just been sucked out of the room, as if my very identity hadn't been erased with a single sharp sentence. I excused myself, set the bottle gently on the pristine granite counter, and walked slowly toward the back corridor where my small secondary bedroom suite was located. They kept laughing behind me. Not one of them, not my own son, bothered to correct his wife, to say, "That's my mother," to say anything that acknowledged my actual worth. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door I'd painted myself 8 years ago when Darren and I first moved into the property. I remembered the day I signed those mortgage papers, my name, my credit, my non-disclosed high-value down payment, funded by the insurance money I received after my parents passed. Darren had just secured his first corporate job. Chloe wasn't in the picture yet. They had nothing. I gave them everything. And now I was the resident caretaker, the help. The next morning, I made coffee like I always did, brewing the expensive non-disclosed coffee brand light roast that Chloe insisted upon. I scooped the high-protein meal for the designer poodle Chloe adored for social media. And when Chloe came downstairs in her luxury, a non-disclosed athletic brand leisure wear, too engaged with her headset to even offer a grunt of a greeting, I stood there and waited. She looked up eventually, annoyance flickering across her face at my silent presence. I handed her the keys, all of them. The main entry, the garden shed, the security gate fob, the mailbox key. "What is all this, Cecilia?" she asked, her perfectly shaped brow furrowed in confusion. I smiled, the same quiet, empty smile I'd perfected the night before. "Good luck covering the monthly payments now." She blinked once, twice, the phone call momentarily forgotten. "The what?" I walked past her, down the immaculate hallway, past the art pieces I had curated, the smart home system I had installed, the baseboards I had often cleaned. I didn't take anything. Just my purse and the tailored wool coat I'd worn the day I brought Darren home from the hospital 3 decades ago. I didn't even say goodbye. I heard Darren calling my name, confused and loud, as I opened the front door. He stumbled after me, socks slipping on the stone walkway, but I kept walking toward the curb. I didn't slam the car door. I closed it gently, calmly, because something inside me had fractured, but it wasn't a destructive snap. It wasn't rage. It wasn't despair. It was absolute clarity. And that clarity was powerful, because clarity is quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't plead. It just knows. And I knew for the first time in decades that I was utterly, finally done. I didn't know exactly where the journey would take me, but I knew where I wasn't staying. The last thing I saw in my side view mirror was Darren standing paralyzed in the driveway. He had no idea how much he'd just lost, and neither did I yet. They say you don't realize you were drowning until you finally take a breath of fresh air. That first night in the small inherited apartment left to me by my great-aunt Vivian, it wasn't immediate freedom. Not yet. It was silence. A thick, echoing silence that felt like a punishing blanket covering everything. The apartment smelled like forgotten time. Aged wood, brittle paper, a clunky old radiator that rattled like it had a chest cold. I dropped my single travel bag on the table and stood there, momentarily disconnected. I just stood staring at the worn linoleum, remembering the beautiful home I had just severed ties with. But it wasn't a beautiful home anymore. Not for me. The next few days after I left the house, I moved like a ghost. I slept on the small, slightly lumpy sofa because the ancient wooden bed frame in the apartment's bedroom was broken and needed repair. I ate simple meals, peanut butter sandwiches on stale bread and microwaved soup. It was a regression to the hard, hungry times of my youth, but this time, the hunger was different. It was for connection, not calories. I didn't call anyone. Not because I had no one, but because no one had called me. Darren didn't text, didn't email, didn't leave a single voicemail after his initial panicked shout in the driveway. 3 weeks passed in that echoing silence. I suppose Chloe had told him not to contact me, perhaps arguing that I was being emotional or dramatic, and that giving me space would make me return sooner. Or maybe worse. Maybe he just didn't care enough to make the effort. I kept thinking about that dinner, about the way they laughed, about the way my own son laughed. I raised that boy alone after my ex-husband, a man with a penchant for a non-disclosed vice, left us financially and emotionally bankrupt. I gave up my career plans, a dream of studying a non-disclosed field, myself. I worked brutal hours, cleaning motel rooms at night and stocking groceries at dawn just to keep a decent roof over our heads. And when my parents passed and left me that substantial insurance money, I used every cent to buy a house, a real home, believing I was securing a future for him. I never asked for rent, never made him pay a dime. And somehow, in Chloe's shallow version of the world, validated by my own son, I had become the help, the resident caretaker. I started writing at night. I found old spiral notebooks in the back of a cupboard, the kind I used to buy for Darren in middle school for his math classes. I filled page after page, not for anyone to read, just for me. I wrote things I had never said out loud, about how I used to stand in the kitchen and wait for him to say, "Thank you" for the home-cooked meals, about how I'd cry silently in the garage when they'd go out to dinner at a non-disclosed restaurant and not invite me, about how I pretended to be asleep so I wouldn't hear them mocking my old-fashioned TV shows in the beautiful living room I paid for. I wrote about the humiliation of being told I was too loud or too messy in my own home. And then one morning, while looking for the source of a persistent draft in the upstairs storage closet of Aunt Vivian's apartment, I found the old, heavy metal trunk Vivian used to keep under her sewing machine. It was rusted, locked, and covered in a thick layer of dust. I struggled to pry it open, expecting it to contain old thread, buttons, or perhaps moth-eaten linens. Instead, I found envelopes, dozens of them, meticulously organized, and one in particular that changed everything. It was addressed to me, Cecilia, in Vivian's familiar, elegant handwriting, dated nearly 3 decades ago. The note read, "If you're reading this, it means you've come back, and I'm deeply sorry you had to." My heart pounded as I unfolded the yellowed, fragile pages inside. There were copies of old hospital forms, handwritten notes, and a single faded photograph of a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. It was not Darren. There was a name written neatly beneath the photo: Adrian Campbell. I read the letter 3 times before the catastrophic implications of the words registered. Vivian had been a nurse at the very hospital where Darren was born. She said she always had doubts. She'd seen something odd in the nursery the night I gave birth. A last-minute room change, a confusion with the identification tags after a small fire alarm forced a partial evacuation. By the time she raised the issue with the night supervisor, it was already too late. The babies had already been released to their parents. She never told me. She said she was afraid of shattering my life as a new single mother, afraid of the legal implications, afraid she was wrong. But then, years later, she found a document buried in the hospital's archived files, a quiet, confidential settlement from the hospital to another family, the Campbells, dated a year after Darren's birth. And that's when she knew. I believe, dear Cecilia, that your son, Adrian Campbell, went home with the Campbells that night, and their son Darren came home with you, the letter concluded. My hands trembled violently. I thought I might pass out. I stared at the photograph, at the name, Adrian Campbell. My mind refused to process it, because if this was true, who was Darren? Who was I to him? And then something strange happened. I didn't feel grief. I didn't feel rage. I felt free. Not because I didn't love Darren, but because suddenly, all those years of emotional pain, of feeling like a stranger in my own life, of that baffling coldness I always felt from him, of that inexplicable distance, it all made a terrifying, painful sense. Maybe that coldness wasn't imagined. Maybe he always felt like a stranger, and maybe I wasn't crazy or overly sensitive after all. I spent the rest of the night reading every paper in that trunk. Vivian had kept it all. DNA reports from a private investigator she hired, affidavits, a small newspaper article about the Campbell family, successful, educated, local, and still living in the same general area. My real son had been here all along, growing up just a few miles away. I folded the letters back carefully, placed them in a new envelope, and put them in my nightstand drawer. Then I looked at myself in the chipped mirror for a long, long time. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't ashamed of her. She was broken, yes, but she was waking up, and the world had no idea what that meant yet. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels punishing. That was the kind of silence I lived in for weeks after reading Aunt Vivian's letter. I didn't know what to do with the information. I carried it inside me like a live wire. Dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. I didn't reach out to Darren. I didn't go looking for Adrian Campbell. I just existed. Each day, I woke up, made a single cup of instant coffee, stared out the dusty kitchen window, and tried to understand who I was now. The Cecilia who raised Darren wasn't the same woman who read those letters. That Cecilia was a mother, a wife once, a caregiver, a perpetual giver. But who was I without that identity? One evening, the aging radiator went out in the apartment. The evening air grew sharply cold. I lit a thick emergency candle and bundled myself in blankets, curling up on the sofa with the hospital files in my lap. I must have read them 100 times. Every line, every signature, every timestamp, it all checked out. It was real. My real son, Adrian Campbell, was born on the same night as Darren, in the same hospital wing, in a facility that would later settle quietly with another family, hoping the truth would never surface. Vivian had made copies of everything before she passed. She left me the pieces of a truth that had been stolen from me. I felt grief, but not for Darren. I grieved the time, the moments I could have had with Adrian, the quiet bedtime stories, the scraped knees and science projects, the simple comfort of raising my own flesh and blood. All those things I thought I was doing for my child, they were meant for someone else. And yet, somehow, I didn't feel hatred toward Darren. My love for him hadn't been biological. It had been unconditional, or so I thought. But when someone you raise doesn't defend you, doesn't even see you, it forces you to reevaluate everything. It was a cold, cruel lesson. I had been chosen, but I was never truly appreciated. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally pulled myself together. I had been hiding too long. I wasn't ready to confront Darren. Not yet. But I could start somewhere quiet. I walked into town and stood across the street from the charming little bookshop near a non-disclosed cross street. Campbell's Books. It was painted in deep forest green with artistic, hand-lettered signs on the windows. I'd passed it dozens of times before and never noticed it. He was there. Adrian. I didn't need to ask. He looked about 30, maybe a little older, clean cut, wearing reading glasses perched low on his nose. He was helping a young woman find a poetry book. His voice was soft, patient. His posture was gentle but sure of itself. I stood across the street, heart pounding violently, eyes fixed on the son I never knew I had, and I cried right there on the sidewalk. Not sobbing, not loudly, just quiet, unstoppable tears that rolled down my cheeks and into the collar of my coat. I didn't go in. Not that day. I just watched. And then I did it again the next day, and the next. It became a ritual. I'd walk the block, sit on the bench near the corner, pretend to check my phone or drink coffee from a paper cup, and I'd watch Adrian living the life I was never part of. It wasn't stalking, it was mourning, but also preparation. Because slowly, I was starting to put the pieces together. While I sat outside that bookstore, I started noticing things: the schedule of deliveries, the names of customers, the rhythm of the store. I was observing, yes, but not just him. I started tracking Darren and Chloe too, subtly. I knew their patterns from memory. Chloe always posted on social media, tagging her favorite brunch spots, yoga studios, and wine tastings at a non-disclosed venue. It wasn't hard to follow the trail, and what I saw made me sick. They weren't struggling. They were pretending. Chloe's business, some superficial lifestyle coaching brand called Chloe Ascends, was mostly smoke and mirrors, rented office space, paid followers, credit cards maxed out to maintain appearances. And Darren, he had quit his stable corporate job 6 months ago. Chloe called it manifesting a new chapter. I called it delusion. They were building a house of cards and they had no idea the wind was coming. I didn't tell anyone what I had discovered. Not yet. Instead, I started keeping a second journal. Not like the first, filled with emotions and heartbreak. This one was strategic. Dates, names, business filings, public records. I wasn't just grieving anymore, I was planning. They thought I was gone, invisible, irrelevant. But I was more present than I had ever been. And I was about to remind them exactly who I was. The first time I saw Adrian Campbell up close, I couldn't speak. It was a rainy Thursday. The bookstore was nearly empty, the air thick with the scent of old paper and rain-soaked wool. He was restocking the biography section, humming softly under his breath. A gentle, melodic sound. I had lingered outside too long, and when he turned and looked through the front window, our eyes met. He gave a polite, welcoming smile. Nothing more. Just the kind of kindness you offer a stranger. And that's what I was to him. A complete stranger. My heart clenched violently. I turned away quickly, pretending to check my phone, but my hands were shaking too hard to fake it convincingly. I walked fast, ducking around the corner, barely making it to the car before the quiet tears came. How do you tell someone that their entire life started with a colossal hospital mistake? How do you look a grown man in the eye and say, "You're not who you think you are, and neither am I"? I went home and pulled out Aunt Vivian's letter again, reading it 3 more times under the dim light of the ancient floor lamp. She hadn't just suspected the truth. She had investigated it. The name Adrian Campbell wasn't a guess. It was confirmed by the settlement papers she had copied. The hospital never told me because I was never meant to know. And the Campbells, they must have known something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to accept a quiet payout. But I wasn't here for revenge against them. I wasn't even sure what I was here for. I just wanted to know him, to see if the ache in my chest could be filled by the reality of who he was. So I went back. I started small. I bought a book, a first edition copy of a non-disclosed classic novel. Adrian rang it up himself. "Good choice," he said with a genuine smile. "Hard to find a clean copy of this edition these days." His voice was warm, familiar, in a way that made my throat tighten with unshed emotion. He handed me the paper bag, his fingers brushing mine for a split second. I nodded, maintaining my mask of polite customer interest. "You own this place." "Sort of," he said easily. "My parents helped me get started. They're retired now, so I keep busy here." Of course they helped. Of course he had support, a stable foundation built on familial love and guidance. Not like Darren, who'd had nothing but my blood, sweat, and sacrifice. and who had turned around and offered me up as a dinner joke. Adrian had parents, but not me. And Darren had me, but never truly wanted what I gave. The universe had scrambled the puzzle and left us all bleeding over the wrong pieces. I started visiting the bookstore every few days, keeping the interactions casual. Sometimes I bought a novel. Sometimes I just browsed the history section. Adrian began to recognize me. He'd say, "Back again?" with that easy, non-demanding smile. We made small talk. The unpredictable spring weather, new books, the best spot for strong coffee downtown. Meanwhile, back in the shadows of my old life, things were shifting according to plan. Darren sent me one message, a text that simply read, "Mom, are you okay?" Nothing more. After 3 weeks of silence, that's all I warranted. I didn't reply. I had nothing left to say, but I started looking deeper into their world. I pulled up the deed to the house. It was still squarely in my name. Chloe had tried to refinance the mortgage without my permission, a failed attempt, as she was immediately denied. She couldn't afford the existing payments, and Darren had no reliable income. I could have evicted them on the spot, but that would have been too quick, too easy. No, I needed them to feel the slow unraveling, the fear, the realization that the foundation they stood on wasn't just fragile. It belonged to someone else entirely. Me. Every night I wrote. My new journal was meticulous. Every receipt, every conversation, every time Adrian mentioned a hobby, a favorite author, a childhood memory, I wrote it down. Not to use against him, but to understand the son I never got to raise. And in between the lines, I began to see the truth more clearly than ever before. Darren didn't treat me poorly because he was switched at birth. He treated me poorly because he chose to, because Chloe gave him permission to, because somewhere along the line, he stopped seeing me as someone to respect and started seeing me as someone to dismiss. But Adrian, he didn't know me at all, and yet he treated me with more genuine kindness in 5 minutes than Darren had in 5 years. I wasn't ready to tell him, not yet, but I was close. And when the time came, I wouldn't just tell him who I was. I would tell him everything about the hospital, about the switch, about the life that was stolen from us both. But first, I had to finish watching the collapse of the life I had already left behind, because once the final piece fell, I wouldn't be looking back. I never planned to become a shadow in my own story. But sometimes, the only way to see people clearly is to deliberately step out of the light. After that intense interaction at Campbell's Books, something shifted inside me. Not suddenly, but with the slow, inevitable momentum of a sunrise creeping across a frozen field. Quiet, powerful, and utterly inescapable. I stopped rushing anything. My focus was no longer just about connecting with Adrian Campbell, the son I never knew. It was fundamentally about reclaiming Cecilia. I began walking a little taller, speaking a little stronger in my daily interactions at the local, non-disclosed cafe. I purchased a sturdy, second-hand laptop and began typing all my accumulated notes into organized files, evidence, timelines, names, and public records. This wasn't a collection of heartbreak anymore. It was strategy, survival, and preparation for a fight I was now fully ready to win. One thing became crystal clear as I organized my findings. Darren and Chloe's world was held together by nothing more than vanity and credit card debt. The house they lived in, my house, was still under my sole legal ownership. Chloe's highly publicized lifestyle business, Chloe Ascends, was a completely fabricated empire. I had evidence of non-existent tax filings for the last 2 quarters and multiple invoices forged to look like they came from real clients who did not exist. Photo shoots were staged at expensive, rented properties she claimed were her own successful design projects. She had built a brand on buzzwords and filters, selling personal growth advice while driving a non-disclosed luxury car she couldn't afford. The financial reality was catastrophic. I confirmed maxed-out credit cards, a recently defaulted private loan, and Darren's substantial student debt still unpaid. They were suffocating under a mountain of bills, but were too arrogant, too obsessed with appearances, to admit defeat. That's when I knew. If I pulled just one essential string, everything would collapse. But I didn't pull it yet, because I had one more step to take first, securing my future and setting the irreversible legal mechanism in motion. I called a highly recommended lawyer downtown, a woman named Eliza Hayes, who was about my age, sharp, direct, and empathetic. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking justice and the restoration of what was rightfully mine. I told her the entire complicated story of the deed, the payments, and my abrupt, justified departure. "I want the house sold, Eliza," I stated firmly. "I have every legal right to it. I made the down payment, paid every utility bill, and never signed the deed over. They benefited from my sacrifice for years. Now I want my name back, my rights, and the legal ownership of my investment restored. If not physically, then legally." Eliza listened without judgment, nodding slowly as she reviewed the documents I provided. "We'll file the motion this week, Cecilia. Given the clean title and your financial history, it will be a swift, non-negotiable process." I signed the necessary papers with a steady hand. That evening, as I drove past the house, the porch light was on. Chloe was sitting on the porch swing, scrolling intensely on her phone, a large glass of a non-disclosed spirit in hand. Inside, Darren was visible on the sofa, immersed in a loud video game. Their lives were still running on destructive autopilot, completely unaware that the legal ground beneath them was already dissolving. It wasn't about punishing them anymore. It was about restoring balance. And when the house sold, they would finally feel what I had felt for years. Powerless. Maybe, just maybe, they'd understand the true weight of being discarded. In the meantime, I maintained my quiet ritual with Adrian Campbell. I still visited the bookstore, and he still didn't know who I was. But each interaction chipped away at my fear and isolation. We talked about books, about life's small complexities, about good coffee, and the perpetual noise of the city. Once we sat at the tiny cafe next door, and he told me about how he almost became a history professor, but his love for physical books pulled him into the retail business. "You remind me of someone," he said once, sipping his herbal tea. "Someone I can't quite place." I smiled, my heart accelerating. "Maybe an old teacher?" He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that resonated deep inside me. "Maybe." That moment lingered. I didn't just like him. I recognized him. Not just from the hospital file or Aunt Vivian's photo, but in the way he treated people, in the way he listened, the quiet, inherent strength in him. It felt like mine. It was in his posture, his calm demeanor, his unhurried presence. I started dreaming about the different life we could have had, one where I had raised him, one where we baked simple goods in the kitchen, where I took him to soccer games and cheered from the sidelines. But I couldn't go back in time. I had to plan for what was next. The first legal domino had fallen, and none of them even knew it yet. I always believed that true strength isn't in how loud you fight, but in how deeply you know you're right. And I knew I was right. The legal mechanism I set in motion with Eliza Hayes was designed for maximum impact, swift, decisive, and delivered at a time when Darren and Chloe would be least prepared. It was a cold, calculated move, but I had learned that survival often requires shedding warmth for sharp edges. The package arrived at the house via a registered courier on a dreary Wednesday morning. It was a thick, official envelope from Hayes and Associates, addressed jointly to Darren and Chloe. Chloe signed for it, visibly annoyed at having to interrupt her morning routine of setting up her phone tripod for a non-disclosed skincare brand review. Inside the package was a formal notice of intent to sell. The document declared my sole ownership of the property, citing the original deed, the complete lack of any co-signing or co-ownership agreements by them, and a meticulously detailed financial history showing my exclusive payment of all principal, taxes, and insurance for the property's entire duration. It granted them a non-negotiable 60-day window to vacate the premises before the house was listed for sale. The shock hit them like a physical blow. Chloe dropped the envelope, scattering the legal pages across the polished hardwood floor. Darren rushed over, having heard her gasp of pure theatrical horror. They read the documents together, their faces draining of color. The reality was undeniable. The foundation of their entire aspirational life was about to be yanked out from under them. The house wasn't theirs. The address, the backdrop for all their carefully curated social media posts and Chloe's fabricated success, was a lie built on my forgotten sacrifice. The text messages started immediately. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, exploded with notifications. First, Darren. "Mom, what is this? This is insane. Call me. You can't do this to us. This is our home. I swear. If this is about the dinner, I'm sorry. We'll fix it." Then, the messages from Chloe, escalating from confusion to outright hostility. "Cecilia, you better stop this. You're being cruel. Don't you dare ruin Darren's life over some old house. We gave you a place to stay. I know people. This lawyer won't help you. You're making a huge mistake, you resident caretaker." The use of that phrase, resident caretaker, was her undoing. It was a dagger twisted deep. I read every single message, but I didn't reply. I blocked their numbers, both of them, on every platform. The silence I had imposed upon them was absolute. This wasn't about an apology. This was about power, control, and the systemic erasure of my identity. An apology now would be meaningless, rooted only in fear of losing their comfort, not in genuine remorse for their actions. I knew the next step would be denial and escalation. Chloe immediately posted a vague, melodramatic story on Instagram about facing unprecedented, inexplicable hardship from those you least expect, tagging Darren and adding a motivational quote about rising above toxic energy. They were already framing themselves as the victims. Meanwhile, I felt a serene calm. I was safe in Aunt Vivian's apartment, which was legally transferred into my name years ago, a quiet, unglamorous asset that had been the real anchor all along. I spent my mornings researching real estate in my new area and my afternoons planning the next phase of my life. I even allowed myself a small indulgence. I bought a set of simple, sturdy tools and fixed the broken antique bed frame. I slept on it that night. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. The restoration of the physical space felt parallel to the restoration of my soul. The following day, I visited Campbell's Books. Adrian was busy with a shipment, boxes piled high in the narrow aisle. He looked tired but happy, his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms. "Rough day, Adrian?" I asked. picking up a newly arrived book on European history. He looked up and gave me a genuine smile, wiping a smudge of dust from his forehead. Just catching up. It's a lot of work, but I love the smell of the ink. It's grounding. Grounding, I repeated. That's a good word for it. He paused, leaning against a stack of boxes. You seem different today, too. More settled. My breath hitched. He saw it. He saw the change in me, a stranger, while my own son was blind to my existence for decades. I am, I said truthfully, looking him straight in the eye. I've finally found my own foundation, Adrian, and it turns out I was building it for years, just in the wrong place. He nodded, sensing the depth of the statement without understanding the context. Well, that's the best kind of freedom, isn't it? The kind you build yourself. The connection was strong, undeniable. A quiet chord of recognition that hummed between us. I knew I couldn't keep the truth about his birth from him for long. It was the only honest, unselfish thing I had left to do in this whole terrifying situation. I left the bookstore, not with a book, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The house, the money, the legal maneuvering. That was the necessary action. Adrian was the reason. He was the anchor, the quiet, gentle man who was truly my son. And for him, I was ready to finally, completely break my silence. I used to think heartbreak came in one big blow, like a car crash or a door slamming shut. But it's not like that. Not always. Sometimes it comes slowly, like water leaking through a roof, drip by drip, until one day the whole ceiling collapses. And Darren, he was finally standing under the flood. The news had reached him by then. The house was officially listed for sale with a local brokerage, a non-disclosed agency. The mask Chloe wore had utterly crumbled. Her Chloe Ascends business exposed as a financial deception, her reputation unraveling in the local social circles. With nowhere else to point the blame, Darren did what he had always done. He came running to me, his ultimate financial safety net. I heard the knock before I saw him. It was a quiet afternoon. I was just finishing a cup of tea when the sound echoed through Aunt Vivian's small apartment. 3 soft raps, hesitant, like the knock of someone who didn't know if he'd be welcomed or slammed. I opened the door slowly. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Unshaven, thinner than I remembered. His expensive, a non-disclosed brand shirt was wrinkled, looking like he'd pulled it off the floor. "Mom," he said, his voice cracked and raw. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer, just stepped aside. He walked in and stood in the middle of the room, looking lost, like he didn't know what to do with his body in this small, unfamiliar space. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "To us?" I almost laughed at the word us, as if there had been an us in years. I sat down in the old floral armchair across from him, calm, composed. "I'm not doing anything to you, Darren. I'm doing something for me." His jaw clenched. "You're selling the house. My house. I grew up there. And you gave it away." "You let your wife turn me into your maid," I said, my voice low and steady. "You watched it happen. You laughed. You never once bothered to correct her, to say, 'That's my mother.' You never even apologized." He didn't deny it. He just looked at the floor, his head bowed. "I thought you were just being dramatic," he mumbled. "I didn't know it hurt you like that." I stared at him. "That's the problem, Darren. You never bothered to know what hurt me. You just assumed I'd always be there, cleaning up after you, paying your bills, nodding along while you let that woman chip away at who I was." He flinched. Chloe's not who I thought she was. That's not news to me, I countered sharply. He finally looked up at me. His eyes were glassy now, desperate. I lost everything. I miss you, he whispered. I raised you, I said, my voice rising slightly, infused with years of suppressed pain. Fed you, clothed you, sacrificed my entire adult life for you, and you let me be humiliated in the house I bought. You chose her arrogance and your pride over my basic respect. His lip trembled. I thought she was helping me. I thought we were building something. You built a lie, Darren, I said simply. And now it's falling apart. He stood then, pacing the room frantically. So that's it? You just walk away? I got up, walked over to the nightstand drawer, and pulled out the envelope Vivian left me. I held it in my hands, its contents a weight that transcended money or property. I'm going to tell you something now, I said. And I need you to listen, really listen. He nodded, confused, pausing his anxious pacing. I handed him the envelope. These are your records. Read them. He sat down, opened it slowly. His brow furrowed as he read Vivian's letter, the hospital files, the copies of the DNA analysis that Aunt Vivian had quietly commissioned years ago. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, a mixture of terror and confusion. This can't be real. It is, I confirmed. You're saying I'm not your son? I'm saying you weren't born to me, Darren, but I raised you as if you were. I gave you every piece of me, even when you didn't seem to want it. He went pale, the last vestige of his composure dissolving. So, who's your real son? I didn't answer that question, not yet. I let him sit there, utterly shell-shocked, his mouth open, the pages trembling in his hands. I don't know who I am anymore, he whispered. A lost boy despite his years. Now you know how I felt, I said, looking away toward the dusty window. For years. He didn't cry in anger, but something deep within him broke. I saw it happen, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a strange, quiet peace. Because I had finally spoken the truth that needed to be said. I walked him to the door. He turned, eyes pleading. Can we fix this? I met his gaze. I don't know, Darren, I said, but it's not my job to try anymore. And I closed the door gently behind him, not with spite, but with finality. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding it open. The house was sold, the lie was exposed, and the truth was finally out. Now it was time for the last, most important conversation. It took me 3 days to decide how I was going to do it. 3 days of quiet, profound stillness in the small apartment, recovering from the emotional devastation of the confrontation with Darren. The house was as good as sold. The legal process was unstoppable. Chloe's social media was entirely dark, a silence louder than any of her staged pronouncements. The lie they had built was rubble. But the most difficult truth remained unspoken, sealed within the walls of Campbell's books. I practiced the conversation in front of the mirror, rehearsing the lines like an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. My name is Cecilia, and I think I might be your mother. The words sounded clumsy, impossible, a joke ripped from a bad movie script. How do you deliver a fact that fundamentally alters a person's entire identity? I finally understood that preparation was useless. The moment would have to be real, raw, and completely honest. On the 4th day, I drove to town. I didn't park across the street on the observation bench. I parked directly in front of the bookstore. I walked straight inside. Adrian Campbell was shelving books near the front window. The store was empty, save for us and the comforting smell of aged paper. He looked up, his face breaking into his usual easy smile, a smile that now felt like a punch to my gut because it was offered to a stranger. "Back again?" he said warmly. "I just got in that memoir I recommended to you, The Quiet Forgiveness. Coincidence, right?" "No coincidence," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to talk to you, Adrian. It can't wait. Is there somewhere we can sit privately?" His smile faded, replaced by concern. He looked closely at my face, sensing the gravity. "Of course. Come to the back office. Are you all right, ma'am?" He led me through a narrow, book-lined passage to a tiny office filled with stacks of invoices and the soft glow of a desk lamp. He offered me the single chair, and I sat down, clutching the familiar thick envelope from Vivian in my hands. "I need you to look at these," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat on the corner of the desk, his hands resting on his knees, attentive and patient. I handed him the envelope. He opened it carefully, pulling out the yellowed documents. Vivian's letter, the hospital forms, the DNA report copies, and the small article about the Campbell family's quiet settlement. He started reading. His eyes moved slowly over the pages, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper as he processed the clinical evidence of a medical catastrophe. I watched his reaction unfold, a silent observer to his internal earthquake. He read Vivian's letter twice. He stopped at the DNA report, his hand running over the printed names, Campbell and Vance. He finally looked up, his face utterly pale, his eyes wide with a confusion that was almost childlike. "The hospital paid my parents off? For a paperwork mix-up?" "Not paperwork," I managed, my throat closing. "A baby switch, a room fire alarm, a tag mix-up, and a hospital trying to cover a gross error." I took a shaky breath. "Adrian, your birth records say you went home with the Campbells, and their son went home with me." I reached out and gently pointed to my name on the hospital form, Cecilia Vance. He put the papers down, his hands trembling. He didn't cry. He simply stared at the documents, then at me. "The Campbells. They adopted me then?" he asked, his voice flat. "No," I whispered, tears finally blurring my vision. "They thought you were theirs, but the hospital alerted them to the swap soon after. They took a settlement and raised you, knowing the truth about the swap. My son, Adrian Campbell, was raised by them. Their son, Darren, was raised by me." Then he did something utterly unexpected. He closed his eyes, took a long, deep breath, and let it out slowly. When he opened his eyes, the confusion was still there, but now mixed with a strange, dawning clarity. I always felt a bit disconnected," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "My parents were wonderful, kind people, but they were always pushing me toward a non-disclosed career field. Academia. Law. They never quite understood the bookstore. They were supportive, yes, but they felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit." He stood up, walked to the window, and stood with his back to me. "The Campbell family, the money, the education, the quiet life. You said they were successful. I have always felt like I was searching for the real me." He turned back around, and his eyes found mine. In that moment, the years of silent observation, the small talk over books, the shared glances across the counter, it all culminated. "You're the woman who's been visiting the store," he said. "The one who always looked like she had a secret." I nodded, unable to speak. "My whole life," he repeated, looking at the papers. then back at me. And you came here. You found me. He walked toward me, slowly, deliberately. I stood up. He stopped just a foot away, not touching me, but close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from him. I saw the gentle patience I had admired from afar, but now directed at the woman who had just overturned his world. "Thank you, Cecilia," he said, the gratitude in his voice genuine. "Thank you for the truth. Even a devastating truth is better than a comfortable lie." And in that small, quiet office, surrounded by the stories of others, I finally reunited with my own. The quiet connection I had felt was real. The ache in my chest subsided, replaced by a profound, terrifying, but exhilarating recognition. The silence was finally broken. The days immediately following the revelation were spent in a whirlwind of quiet, intense conversation. Adrian was calm, thoughtful, and astonishingly pragmatic. He introduced me to his parents, the Campbells, a kind, reserved couple who were clearly relieved that the long-held secret was finally out in the open. They admitted they always suspected the mix-up was a switch and not merely a paperwork error, and the hospital settlement was predicated on their silence. They treated me with a gentle respect that I had forgotten existed. Adrian and I began the painstaking process of piecing together 30 years of lost time. We didn't rush. We sat for hours sharing stories, his about growing up surrounded by books and academic pressure, mine about raising Darren amid sacrifice and financial struggle. The connection was natural, immediate, and utterly affirming. It makes sense why I always felt drawn to quieter things, the simple routines, Adrian confessed one afternoon, sipping tea in my small apartment. And maybe why Darren? Why he felt the need to always reach for the biggest, loudest thing, even if it was fake. The legal world, meanwhile, was moving on its own cold, relentless track. Eliza Hayes called 2 weeks later with the final update. "The house is officially sold, Cecilia," she announced. "The buyers closed quickly. Given your clear ownership and the fact that Darren and Chloe had no legal standing, the process was seamless. The proceeds, a significant, non-disclosed high-value sum, the fruit of my decades of toil and the house's appreciation, were secured in a trust account in my name. Darren and Chloe were given notice by the new owners and were forced to vacate. They didn't go quietly. I saw a final desperate post from Chloe on a secondary social media account, a tearful video claiming they were victims of a financially abusive, vindictive relative and that karma would find them. The response was muted. Most people had moved on from her manufactured drama. Darren tried one last direct maneuver. He sent an email from an old address bypassing the blocks. It wasn't an apology for the humiliation. It was a plea for cash. "Mom, we're completely ruined. Chloe's business is dead, and we have nowhere to go. If you could just lend us a fraction of the sale price, say 10%, we could start over. You owe me that much after everything. After everything. After the humiliation, after the lies, after the revelation that he wasn't even biologically mine, his entitlement remained the same. He still viewed me as a resource to be tapped, not a mother to be respected." I deleted the email without reply. The emotional cord was finally, irrevocably severed. I felt a pang of loss for the boy I had raised, a grief that was real, but it was overshadowed by the peace of knowing I was no longer responsible for his choices. My next meeting with Eliza Hayes focused on the future. I had the money, but I knew I couldn't simply keep it for myself. My decades of sacrifice had been for a legacy, and that legacy had to be protected from corruption. I instructed Eliza to establish a non-disclosed Vance Foundation for single mothers' education. The foundation's purpose would be to provide tuition and living expenses for single mothers attempting to finish their degrees or vocational training. The exact opportunity I had sacrificed for Darren's future. A significant portion of the house sale proceeds would be irrevocably dedicated to this cause. This was the true victory. The money would now serve a purpose far greater than financing Chloe's leased cars or Darren's delusions. It would fund genuine, deserving second chances. I retained enough to purchase a small, comfortable condo near Adrian's bookstore, a place of my own, free of any history with Darren or Chloe. One evening, Adrian came over to help me arrange my books. He saw the old metal trunk from Aunt Vivian sitting in the corner. "That's where it all started, isn't it?" he said softly. "It is," I confirmed. "And I'm so glad you're here, Adrian." He looked at me, his eyes full of the kindness I had only seen from afar. "I'm glad too, Cecilia. I feel like I finally know why I love old books and why I always felt like I was waiting for someone. I had lost the son I raised, but I had gained the truth, the respect I deserved, and a son who saw me, not my bank account." The silence was over, and the healing could finally begin. I've always believed that the most profound acts of closure are often quiet, personal, and utterly definitive. There were no grand final pronouncements, no courtroom drama. My reckoning with the past was sealed in the small, comfortable, and sunlit condo I had purchased, a few blocks away from Adrian's bookstore. This was my sanctuary, paid for by the truth and by the decades of sacrifice I had reclaimed. The last vestige of the life I had left behind was the financial settlement document, signed by Eliza Hayes, confirming the final sale of the house and the allocation of funds to the non-disclosed Vance Foundation for single mothers' education. It was a massive, weighty document bound in a dark blue cover. I set the document on the antique mahogany desk I had bought, my first significant personal purchase. I looked at the names. Cecilia Vance. My name, no longer tied to a mortgage, a son's entitlement, or a daughter-in-law's fabricated reality. My final act of closure was simple. I found the last remaining physical evidence of Darren's final, desperate plea. A printed copy of the email I had ignored, where he had asked for the 10% loan. I looked at the words one last time, recognizing the familiar, deep-seated sense of entitlement that had never truly been about love. I didn't burn it. I didn't frame it as a victory trophy. I took the email printout and walked over to the non-disclosed office supply brand crosscut shredder I had recently bought. With a quiet, cold finality, I fed the paper into the machine. The sound of the grinding mechanism was brief, decisive, and entirely satisfying. The pieces that emerged were confetti, useless, and unrecognizable. The financial legacy I had toiled for was now secure and clean. The foundation was established, its board meeting set for the following week. My resources would now fuel genuine aspirations, not fabricated ones. My life, which had been defined by the needs of others for so long, finally opened up to my own quiet desires. I enrolled in an online history course, a fulfillment of the academic dream I had shelved 30 years ago. I began spending my mornings at Adrian's bookstore, not as a desperate observer, but as a silent, helpful volunteer. I organized the back office, tidied the shelves, and learned the intricacies of the small business he loved. Adrian's presence was the true reward. Our relationship grew gently, built on honest conversations, shared genetics, and a profound mutual understanding of loss. He still spent holidays with the Campbells, who remained a deeply important part of his life, but he would stop by my condo afterwards, bringing over coffee and staying late to talk. One evening, he asked me about my favorite color. Emerald green, I told him. He smiled. My father's favorite tie is emerald green. I always hated it. Funny how things are mixed up. Maybe not mixed up, I corrected softly. Maybe just redistributed. I decided against ever revealing the truth to Chloe or the Campbells about Darren's confrontation and his own knowledge of the switch. That painful truth was between Darren and me. He had to live with the knowledge of his true parentage and the choices he made while believing I was his mother. His loss was self-inflicted, but the truth was a burden he deserved to bear alone. My final conversation with Eliza Hayes confirmed the complete, irreversible detachment. You're legally clean, Cecilia, she said. The past is closed. I looked out the window of my new condo, watching the city lights flicker on. I was 65 years old, and my life was just beginning. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and discarded, but I had used that pain to fuel a strategic awakening. I had exchanged a life of invisible servitude for one of genuine connection and powerful purpose. The woman who was laughed at over a dinner table was gone. In her place stood the matriarch who had taken back her name, her money, and her life, securing a legacy for others while finally finding her own son. My silence had been broken, and my new life was wonderfully loud. What do you think of Cecilia's final move? Share your thoughts below. And remember, your voice matters. Send your true story confidentially to womenstoriess@segmail.com. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe.